Public Library, and I want to welcome you all here tonight. You guessed, since we were getting out more chairs, we weren't expecting to have quite so many people. So we're really glad to see you here for this special program. We're doing this program as part of a community project called The Big Read. Have you all heard of The Big Read before?
Yes.
Some of you have heard of The Big Read. In The Big Read, we try to get everyone in the community reading the same book, all during the month of March. We have gotten a grant, this is the 4th year, from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And I've said that so many times I should remember it, but I can never remember it. And the Community Foundation of the Central Blue Ridge got the grant and have been helping with the various activities, and all the libraries have lots of activities. And so that's what we're doing tonight. And the book that was chosen for this year is a novel called The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. This was written by a woman named Carson McCullers. She grew up in Georgia and wrote this book and had it published when she was only 23 years old, and that was in the early about 1939 or 1940. And the book is set during the Depression in Georgia in the South. One of the main characters in the book is a deaf man who communicates by signing, but in his town he only has one friend. And unfortunately the friend is taken to a mental hospital, and then he really has no friends and he's very lonely. And there are other lonely people in the town, and they come and talk to him, even though he has to read their lips. He can't understand, he can't hear them. So it's a book about loneliness and things like that. Well, loneliness is not a very fun subject to have for a program. So we decided we wanted to do a program about what it was like growing up deaf. We don't know much about the character in this book, but we know that a lot of people in Stanton know about growing up. And we thought a good person to tell us about growing up deaf would be Rocoo DeVito, because he grew up into deaf. Now, he didn't grow up during the Depression. He's old, but he's not that old. And he didn't grow up in the South either. What? Oh, but we're going to forgive him for not growing up in the South. A lot of us didn't grow up in the South. But we think that growing up in New Jersey in the 50s was probably a lot like growing up in the South in the 30s. Is that it?
We'll find out.
We'll find out. So most of you know Mr. DeVito, don't you?
Yes.
A lot of you do. He worked at VSD, yes. Worked at VSDB for many, many years and was a coach. And he won a lot of games.
Yeah.
So we're very pleased to have him here tonight to talk about growing up. And that's all I'm going to say, except if you need to use the restroom, down the hall on the left. The left. The left. Down the hall. Down the hall. Miss Barbara, you'll have to leave if you can't behave. Now, we do have a few more copies of the book if someone wants to take one to read. We also have schedules of events. This is the library schedule event. And there are also a few readers' guides that tell about the book. So there's some of these things back on the table there. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rocoo.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much, Ruth, for the nice introduction. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous. I was invited to give a presentation this evening. I'm wondering, what should I say? I have to read this book. I'm a little anxious, I have to admit. I watched the movie. I asked, should I analyze the book, the story, anything? And they said, no, just explain your experiences as a deaf person growing up. So that I was relieved to hear that. Tonight, I want to talk about some interesting stories. I'll have some pictures to show. Without the pictures, my lecture might be a little dry if you just watch somebody tell stories. Everyone will sort of maybe fall over from boredom. But I'd like to start with 2 deaf jokes. The first joke is titled 3 Deaf Persons Riding a Train. So we have 3 people on a train. First is a deaf American, the second is a Cuban, deaf Cuban, and the third is a deaf Russian. The deaf Cuban has a cigar in his hand. Smells the cigar, lights the end of the cigar. This is on the train as the train's going. Rings of smoke going through, cigars burning down slowly, and opens the window and just throws the cigar out the window. The American and Russian say, "Whoa, why did you waste the rest of that cigar?" "Ah, it's no big deal. Back in Cuba, we have plenty of cigars. Not a problem." Ah, so the 2 other men realize. Now the deaf Russian pulls out a flask of vodka and slowly only drinks about a quarter of it. There's 3/4 of it left. Opens the window and throws it out the window. The other 2 men say, "Well, you're wasting this great vodka. Because you don't understand, in Russia we have plenty of vodka to spare. It's not a big deal at all." So now the deaf American is sitting there, and by the aisle, he's sitting in the aisle, and there's a hearing man that starts walking down the aisle. He picks him up and throws him out the window. And the other 2 men are shocked and say, "In America we have plenty of hearing people." Okay, are you familiar with the story of King Kong, the giant ape? He happened to be deaf. I'm not sure if you were aware of that. So he saw a beautiful woman walking by, fell in love with her immediately. He's overtaken by love, picks her up, and says, "I want to marry you." That's how I'm married. So I watched the movie The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. I did notice some similarities within the deaf community that I experienced, but depending on where the deaf persons lived and worked. I noticed that deaf people living in small towns where there's only a few deaf people living together, they tend to be very lonely. There's a small community, only 2 or 3. The deaf people live in larger cities, Richmond, Virginia, Northern Virginia, on the Eastern Shore. There's a larger amount of deaf people there, larger interactions, there's more deaf events. So the loneliness is mitigated by that. I grew up in New Jersey. I wasn't lonely in my deaf residential school. I had a very happy and healthy childhood at my deaf residential school for 14 years. I became lonely during my college days. During the summer breaks, when my girlfriend was gone, she went back home for the summer and we were apart for 3 months. My girlfriend lived in Missouri. I was very lonely during that time. I missed her. But we thrived on love letters that we exchanged with each other. Every day, I'd go to the mailbox expecting something. I'd come home from work, my mom would bring the mail up and said, "Oh, you got something from Donna, your girlfriend." And so I'd run in there in my bedroom and open it up and slowly go through the love letter. It was a very powerful feeling. Sometimes I'd get teary, made me want to see her. I remember one summer during the break from college, a printing company that I worked for closed for inventory for 2 weeks. So my mother said, "Do you want to visit Donna out in Missouri?" And yes, of course I wanted to see her. My mom called Donna's mother and let her know that Rocco is off work for 2 weeks. And Donna's mother said, "Come on, yeah, come visit us out in Missouri." So I got a Greyhound bus ticket, rode out to Missouri, 36 hours, sat through that bus. You know, this is hot summer Greyhound bus ride. Finally arrived in Kansas City, I meet with Donna's father at 5:30 in the morning. I was wide awake throughout the night. I was so excited to see her. Went to Donna's house, chatted until about 10 or 11 in the morning. Finally, I was so tired I had to tuck in for a nap. Stayed there for a week, hoping to stay for a second week. And then my mother happened to call me and say, "By the way, the printing company has reopened early, so I had to go back to work." And it, you know, a little disheartening to have to go back to work, so I flew back. That loneliness happened to me during the breaks of school, but growing up in a deaf residential school, I loved it. I really cherish that school. And I want to start a little bit by showing you pictures of my family. These are my parents. Should we dim the lights a little bit? Would that help?
I don't have a dimmer. I don't know if they'll be able to see that.
Is that is better. That's better. Is that can everybody see okay?
It looks clear from on the camera too.
Make it bigger.
My father was also named Rocco. Rocco Sr., I'm Rocco Jr. My father was born in Italy. He came over on a boat in 1923. He met my mother in New Jersey. My mother was born in America, in New Jersey. My mother's parents were born in Italy, though. My mother, before her maiden name, was Calandriello. I think I heard.
You don't know?
Off the top of my head. My mother married, and then, my mother's parents married and then became Cardiello. And my mother grew up Rose Cardiello. And she married my father, became Rose DeVito. So it's interesting, all the last names ending in O. My father didn't have much education in Italy. Grew up there, he joined the military. Was in the war in Austria. Moved to America. He learned a trade here as a shoe repairer, a cobbler. That was his trade. He worked in New York, then moved to New Jersey, set up his own shoe repair business there. Life was tough for him. His income was varied quite a bit. He didn't have a stable income. He spoke very little English. He spoke fluent Italian, but very little English. My mother grew up speaking Italian, and then when she went to school, as she got older, learned English, and then spoke English fluently. My father, as they conversed, started to pick up English a little bit from his wife, my mother, but very, very good parents, and they're very dear to me. They encouraged me. They wanted the best for my brother and I. My mother really pushed me quite a bit. This is me.
Okay.
I was born hearing. This is at 10 months of age. I lived in New York, in Brooklyn. 10 months, had a nice fat face, chubby cheek. I love to eat. I was hearing though at this time. At 2 years old, I lost my hearing through an unknown illness. Sensorineural loss was the name of my hearing loss, meaning that it's unrepairable. The nerves were permanently damaged. I can't remember what it was like to hear. I can't remember hearing any sounds as a child. I was 2 years old. My mother was shocked. You know, every parent, how they would feel if something like this happened. The initial shock of that, she went to the doctor, went to various doctors. And then each doctor, audiological tests found that I was, in fact, deaf. My mom felt like God punished her. She was devastated. But she was a strong person. She had to be strong. She was very resilient. And then as I became older, I went to public school. I found I couldn't function in public school without hearing. I was deaf. Went to the doctors again. The doctors recommended a New Jersey school for the deaf. My mother, enrolled me in New Jersey School for the Deaf in West Trenton, New Jersey, near the Trenton Capital Government Center. And that was the best thing that ever happened in my life. These are my grandparents. They moved to America from Italy, married here in America. In 1902, they bought a 3-story home. I remember growing up, I lived in their house. They both spoke Italian. I didn't understand, of course, what they were saying. They had 14 children.
Wow.
4 of their children died during their infancy. So the 10 children that were remaining, my mom had 5 sisters, 5 brothers. All of my aunts and uncles spoke English, went to school. When speaking with grandparents, there was a struggle to communicate. They picked up very little English. They spoke what we call broken English. But they were great people. They spoiled me. They spoiled me to hell, basically. They fed me so much. They brought food to the house, left it there for me. And I lived on the 3rd floor of the house. And I just want you to realize that that house, the 1st floor were my grandparents. And my aunt, their youngest daughter, also lived on the 1st floor. The 2nd floor of the house were 2 uncles, which were their 2 sons. On the 3rd floor of the house was my family. In that house, there were 3 different languages spoken in that house. Grandma and grandfather, strong Italian speakers. Their children spoke English. My brother and I, who's also deaf, strong ASL users. So we had 3 different languages in that house. I didn't realize that at the time. I took it for granted back then, the years, and now that I look back, wow, I realized that 3 different languages existed in that house. It was a great thing. This is my mother's sisters. My mother was the oldest of all her sisters. And her 5 sisters, they all spoke English. We communicated back and forth through writing notes. They would gesture, if they talked about going to a baseball game or eating food that's delicious, school is great. They would have these sort of gestures, very short sentences, and the notes we wrote back and forth were very short and simple. But every year during holidays, Thanksgiving or Christmas, the whole family, aunts and uncles, grandmother and grandfather, everyone would get together at the house. We would had a big feast. And then when I'd arrive, happy Thanksgiving, hugs all around, how are you? Everyone would gesture and we sort of got along in that way. And then the family would all get together, and then my brother and I, the only 2 deaf people, would be in our own room and be able to converse back and forth. Because the rest of the family all spoke English. We would write notes back and forth with them if we needed to interact with them. The youngest sister, when my mother was 20 years old, her sister Mildred was born in the house. My mother saw her being born in the house when she was 20 years old. Smartest of all the sisters, most successful career, and she was the youngest of all 5 siblings. And she just passed away last year. Very smart woman. She had a good job at Western Electric. She was a laborer, was promoted to a supervisor. And this was in New Jersey. She became supervisor. She got a lot of resistance from the men who worked there. Men felt like a woman supervising them weren't able to accept that. But she was a very strong-willed woman, and then over time she won their respect. Very smart woman. Again, loved her so much. She never married. She decided to take care of her parents until they were gone. And just understand, in Italian culture, typically the youngest child tends to stay home with the parents until they pass away. These days, times have changed. It's not quite the same, but again, I would converse with all 5 of my aunts through gesturing and maybe writing notes back and forth. I tried to teach my mom sign, and she said, I can't learn. The New Jersey School for the Deaf superintendent told me to speak with my mother at all times. So as I grew up in New Jersey School for the Deaf, they used an oral approach with the students. But I noticed that in the middle school teachers and the high school teachers, they signed. They knew that the deaf children struggled with the oral approach, reading lips and trying to speak. And so often they would close the classroom doors and we would sign in class behind closed doors. If the principal came and knocked on the door, everyone would put their hands down and just start speaking. And writing on the board. And we had to. Every time the principal came into the classroom, the students had to rise, had to stand up to show respect for the principal. These days, that's not the case. So, in our days, the principal came in, good morning, everyone stood up. I remember my first principal in high school, gentleman, Tobias Brill. His son, who eventually became the first superintendent of the California School for the Deaf in Riverside. His father was my principal. And he'd say, speak to me. And you must talk. You know? So he instructed us to speak to him. We had to live up to the school's oral philosophy. But in the classroom, the deaf students signed in class, in middle school and high school. When we went to the dormitories, we would sign we would use ASL the whole time. The teachers, they knew that we couldn't speak. I saw some deaf children who lost their hearing at a later age, when they were 10 or 12 years old. I noticed that those kids could maintain their speech skills. But me losing my hearing at such a young age, I never developed those speech skills, so I struggled to learn the oral approach. And then when I'd go home, I'd try to speak to my mother. She understood a little bit. She understood my deaf voice, and she'd tell me, you know, your voice is too high, you need to speak lower. And while I was courting Donna, before we got married, I brought Donna to my parents' house. I was very proud of Donna, showing her, you know, this is my girlfriend. And Donna tried to speak to my mom. My mom didn't understand one word that she said because Donna had a lower pitched voice, and my mom would try to instruct her to speak in a higher pitch. So I would sort of speak for Donna. And then when I visited Donna's parents in Missouri, I tried to speak to her mom and dad, and they didn't understand me. My deaf voice was too high, and so Donna would sort of interpret for me to her parents, speaking in her voice that they were used to. But her dad and I would write notes back and forth. Her dad was a very reserved person, would write notes back and forth with me. Then we eventually got married. We would go to Missouri almost every summer, stay for a month with her parents. I would do chores for her parents. I would mow their grass, clean the house, help any way I could. I really enjoyed visiting her family until they eventually passed away. But they never understood my speech. I suppose it was too high-pitched for them. And then again, my parents couldn't understand her speech. It was interesting that our voices are different. I attended New Jersey School for the Deaf. Again, the best thing that ever happened to me in my life. I loved my school. 3 years ago, the school had a big reunion. About 900 deaf alumni came back to the school. They selected me to serve as Master of Ceremony of the banquet. I think there was maybe about 600 students. There was lectures, presentations. One day before I went into the Hall of Fame, I spoke a little bit about my appreciation to the deaf school that I grew up in. I really admired that school. It took good care of me growing up. For 14 years, the administration and teachers were all very good to me. And during my time in high school, I had a lot of hearing teachers. There was only one deaf teacher in high school. All the other teachers were hearing. They could all sign. They weren't all fluent, but they signed good enough. I happened to have 3 excellent teachers: an English teacher, a language arts teacher, and a reading teacher. All were very fluent, and that helped me improve my writing ability. They really encouraged me to read more. Reading was hugely emphasized, and write more. And then, again, language arts and English, I wrote a lot of compositions. And then when I attended Gallaudet, when I took the Gallaudet entrance exam, I passed. And 8 out of 9 in my class passed. And we were called to the superintendent's office. The superintendent was, again, a strong believer of the oral approach. He told us, "Congratulations, I'm surprised that you passed." And we felt like, wow, that's a little bit of a backhanded compliment. But we felt like we were college material. But back then, our school was not accredited. And it was only up to 10th grade that it was accredited, but we managed okay after that. I remember the school lacked literature materials, algebra materials. I remember the last year of school, we had sparse materials. But did get into college. The superintendent and principal were quite shocked that we actually got in. That's my deaf brother. His name is Tony. The interpreter's uncle, and the lady sitting here is Paul. At that time, the school had 2 separate departments. One department was academic, and the other department was vocational. The academic department, the principal would evaluate the students, their academic skills, and see where they were placed. If they were college material, they would stay there. If they felt like that student wouldn't be college bound, they would be moved to the vocational department. My brother, he had a good mind, but he liked to play a little too much. The principal moved him to the vocational department. And my brother didn't take it very well, but my brother had great vocational skills. He learned how to work a lathe machine, graduated from the vocational department with a vocational diploma, got a good job. But during over 40-some years, some businesses closed. He worked a variety of jobs because of business closing, but he eventually retired. I took a printing course, not full-time, but I was in the academic department. That's me at the age of 12, chubby cheeks still. I loved school, loved to play outside. During my time, a good thing about the school was the school would never let the kids stay in the dorm after class. The kids had to go outside or go to the gym. The dorm was locked, so the kids had to go out and find something to do outside. So I look back that maybe the School for the Deaf practiced total student development. Maybe they didn't realize it at the time, but the philosophy they actually practiced, it was called the SPICE, the acronym. The S was social element of a student's development. P, physical. You were encouraged to play in sports and intramural activities. Varsity JV, we had a lot of different sports kids can be involved in. I was for intellect. You joined different organizations, a debate team, and so forth. The C, 24-hour communication. You had access to communication 24/7 in a residential school because you had class all day signing, and you go to the dorm, sign with your peers all throughout the day and evening. So that you had 24/7 access to communication. And then E was the emotional development of a student. Learning how to manage yourself emotionally. If your team lost, if you are in a class debate or organization and you're upset, you learn how to manage those things as a developing student. So the school practiced that. Any deaf school in America practicing that, I feel the school will survive and thrive. If the school is missing a few of these elements, I feel the numbers will dwindle because it's the total approach of this philosophy are vital to the total student development. It's extremely important. Anytime the parents bring a deaf child to a residential school and they see the program, if they have after-school program, activities, plus there's a good athletic program, this is really important. It's important to have both a strong academic and an athletic program. Both of these in tandem will allow the school to survive. Some deaf schools now, we see dwindling numbers. They're not great athletically. Some schools aren't great academically. So having that total approach in both academics and athletics is very important. BSDB academic program right now is not in the greatest shape. The athletic program not in the greatest shape. Academic seems to be okay. But back in the New Jersey School for the Deaf, we had that total approach. When I was 14 years old, I didn't join JV basketball. I focused more on playing intramural sports, wrestling, and so forth. One of the staff noticed me, told the basketball coach, Rocco has potential to play basketball. and the coach came up to me in the cafeteria one evening and said, "Go to JV practice tonight." Just came up and sort of ordered me to go. And so I obliged, went to practice, gave me gym shoes, and I was on the JV team for 2 years, and then 2 years switched to varsity. And thanks to my coach and my intramural director, that was allowed to happen. As a basketball player, as a graduate from the New Jersey School for the Deaf, I remember graduating. My mother and father, grandparents, aunts, uncles all came to see me graduate. Every year, New Jersey School for the Deaf had their graduation ceremony on Father's Day. This was a tradition for many years. And after graduation, I would go back to my home. We would have a graduation party in a restaurant with my family. My parents would host all my relatives to come to the party. The next morning, I'd wake up. I broke down. I just started crying. My mother and father tried to console me, asking me what's wrong. And I said I missed my school. I realized that I was done. For 14 years, it was hard for me to disconnect from that. I had developed such a strong bond with the New Jersey School for the Deaf. The friends I had made there, the academics, the athletics, all the supports I had there, it was just a wonderful life. During the weekends, I never felt bored. We always had a lot of things to do at school. Our coaches would take us to go see college games, pro games. We'd always be off campus on the weekends. And now, almost all deaf residential schools are closed from Friday to Sunday because to save money on electricity, water, and the staffing too. So times have changed. But back in my time, the kids stayed throughout the weekends until the big break. So I broke down the day after I graduated. And my parents said, "Don't forget you'll go to college that fall." And thank God for that. So I went to Gallaudet University. I entered college as a prep. Back then, they had a 5-year program at Gallaudet. First year was your preparatory year, and then your next year you would be a freshman. So then you'd go through the regular freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Now Gallaudet has done away with the prep year and has a traditional 4-year program. But the prep year was my best year in my college life because everything was so new to me. I met so many students from all over the world. I remember I had classmates from Holland, one classmate from India, just the world around. We had international students. So my prep year was just sort of an amazing experience. My mind grew so much, 360 degrees of my mind. I had this open-minded experience. And also during my prep year, I had great teachers, all deaf. Almost all my teachers were deaf. And all very scholarly. And I learned so much from them. Some of my professors would say, you finished schooling in 10th grade, you need to write more. You have fairly good vocabulary, but you need to take it to the next level, more advanced vocabulary. I remember the summer before I attended college, I decided to improve my English. I was really motivated. I had to, something I had to work on. So I told my mother I wanted to buy a New York Times newspaper, and I don't know if you all remember, the Times printed always very formal English. They never used slang. They always printed very formal English and always used very complex words. So I bought the newspaper every day, and I would write down words I didn't know, and I would try to focus on these words, look them up in the dictionary, put down the meanings in my notepad. Most of these words were from the sports pages, something I was interested in. And I would always get the word definition and the example sentence. So up to I had to learn 500 words before I went into my prep year of college. Met my classmates, and a lot of them didn't know the words I had learned. It made me feel good about myself to prepare myself in that sense. But I had to work hard for that because I finished school in 10th grade. I wanted to improve before I went into college. But now I really love learning the English language plus ASL. For every deaf student to survive, you have to be bilingual. Deaf people have to have good English and good ASL to thrive. You can't just only be, of course signing an ASL is nice, but you have to be good signer and proficient English, period. That's just the way it has to be. You can't say that ASL is enough. It's really important, and I'm happy for aggressively reading and looking up these words in the dictionary. And my mom loved to read, and that inspired me too. My mom every night read the newspaper, every night, no fail. After her chores were done, after a long day of work, after she washed all the dishes, and so forth. You might be 7 o'clock or so. Open the newspaper, our local newspaper, without fail, and seeing my mom read the newspaper all the time made me sort of develop that love for reading and helped me improve my English. So again, the deaf kids have to learn a lot, and thanks to the library for encouraging that too. Every deaf student who enrolled in Gallaudet University admired Abraham Lincoln. He signed the charter giving the authority to Congress to allot degrees and monies to colleges and universities. And in 1864, Lincoln signed this paper to allow the authority. And let's see, it's Columbia International Institute for the Deaf. Back then, it wasn't called Gallaudet University. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of. Every year, the president signs Gallaudet's degrees. And back at my time, Lyndon B. Johnson signed my degree from Gallaudet, and I have that up at my house. It's interesting that LBJ has signed my college degree. Me as a graduate of Gallaudet University, I missed college life, but I didn't miss studying, but I missed college life, the friends I'd made and so forth. So I graduated, got a job. Now, my first job was at Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind. That year in 1963, our superintendent, who was Joe Shinpaw, he happened to be a former Gallaudet graduate student. He lived on campus at the Arkansas School for the Deaf, grew up there. He was among deaf children. He knew deaf culture and knew how deaf people were. He tended to hire more deaf teachers and deaf staff. That was his, he also wanted them to be role models for all the deaf students. So 1963, 1964 to 1970, I remember about 10 or 12 deaf teachers were hired into the deaf department at BSDB. And I remember at one time, BSDB used to boast that all of the high school teachers were deaf. And at that time, we encouraged deaf students to go to Gallaudet, become teachers. We motivated them to get into the teaching profession. Now that has dwindled. It's a smaller school, but I really love BSDB. One of the most beautiful campuses, has a very rich history. This main hall is a Virginia historical landmark. Main hall is the most well-kept building in Virginia, according to HS, the Historic Foundation. That's what they said. Oh. Met my wife in college. My 30th birthday here. Remember that year, school had a winning year. We had a football championship, basketball championship, baseball runner-up to the championship. Many of the kids went to Gallaudet from that graduating class. One of my friends hosted a surprise birthday party for me. My friend told me, go down to the stairway, in the apartment stairway. So I opened it up, saw a box down there, and I had a ribbon on the box. I opened the box, and out came Donna, my wife, and it just shocked me. I remember that, my 30th birthday. It was incredible. I traveled a lot with Donna. That was my mom, at 80 years of age. She was a blessing, or she was blessed to have 5 grandchildren. Our daughter is here. And the interpreter you're hearing right now with the hoarse voice is right there. Do you remember, again, I said my mother pushed me, wanted the best for me, really motivated me as a young student to read and write. And when I graduated from Gallaudet University, I taught at the New Jersey School for the Deaf. She wanted me to teach at the New Jersey School for the Deaf. And I said, I don't want to go back to my old school. I want to have my own identity, have a fresh start somewhere. I did. Eventually, she asked me enough. I finally gave in, applied for the job. The superintendent told me I have to take a civil service exam. That was the New Jersey's policy. But they tended to hire veterans first for jobs there. They prioritize veterans. So as a deaf person, I felt like I was a little pushed aside, so I applied at another deaf school, Virginia School for the Deaf, also Kendall School for the Deaf in Washington, D.C. So I chose VSDB. I'm glad I did. Because VSDB gave me the opportunity to coach all the sports. Football, basketball, baseball. I lived on campus, and I lived like a king. It was great. I had a nice apartment there. The rent in that apartment, $57. Food and that was food and lodging. There was no extra charge for water, utilities, nothing. It was really a great experience. For 7 years I lived there before Donna took me away to get married and we moved out. And again, my mother was blessed to have 5 great, beautiful grandchildren. But they all hear, but they all sign fluently. Children, so all the children you see here are, we would call them CODAs, children of deaf adults, because they're hearing, because their mother and father are both deaf. So I have 3 children, my brother has 2. I remember working at VSDB until about 1975. A friend of mine from Chicago tried to get me to go to teach at a new high school program in Chicago. He said, you could be football coach, basketball coach, and then, it's a new challenge for you. And this was a day school that they had set up in Chicago. I gave in to the temptation, and my wife and I both were able to get a job moving to Chicago. Stayed there for 1 or 2 years. We became homesick. Moved back here. I moved back in 1977. I wanted to coach again, but all the coaching positions were already filled at VSDB, unfortunately. I was wondering, why wouldn't I could join a refereeing association, so I became an official for football, basketball, and baseball. But I want you to keep in mind that I was the only deaf one, deaf official. All the other officials were hearing. During conventions or meetings, I had to have an interpreter every time. And sometimes I'd have a hard time securing an interpreter for any meeting. I asked one of my colleagues to maybe take notes for me during the meetings. And I joined a football refereeing association, a basketball refereeing association. I worked doing that for 20 years. I really enjoyed that. I'm glad that I was able to be part of the deaf community and the hearing community and function within both, writing notes and gesturing back and forth with hearing people. And to be a good official, you have to know English, because to read the rule books, you have to know how to interpret the rules, and the rule books, you just have to be able to read them. If a deaf person can't read, they're not able to become an official. I had to take the officials exam every year, and it was all 100 true or false questions. Some of the questions were very tricky. All the referees had to make a 70 or better to maintain their officiating certificate. I happened to have the opportunity to referee district championship games, regional championship games. So I knew that I was very fortunate to have that opportunity. I'm glad that I was able to take advantage of that. I got to meet a lot of coaches, a lot of fans. Some of the hearing referees would tell me, Rocco, you're really lucky that you can't hear. And why? Boy, those fans are screaming at you, booing you, and it's embarrassing. And me not being able to hear, it's great. Nothing has happened. They'd have to throw tomatoes at me before I'd be able to notice it. But in 20 years, that never happened. So he said the other officials had to put up with that. But I had to be thick-skinned. I remember learning from those experiences to never change your calls. If you change your calls, it'll make things worse. So always go with your gut feeling. Unless I asked another official, to validate what I had called, and then we'd make a change as a group decision. But don't just change your call on your own. Make the first call and that's it. And I was never a perfect official, but I enjoyed it for 20 years. This was umpiring baseball games. I don't know if you are aware, but before the games, the 2 or 3 umpires would get together I happened to be assigned to being the home plate umpire, meaning that I was responsible to explain the ground rules, but I couldn't speak. So my colleagues would sort of speak for me. They explain and inform the coaches, Rocoo's deaf, and they would explain the rules, or the ground rules to the coaches. All I would have to do, my duty was to work behind the plate. I had to focus on each pitch. You can't divert your attention at any second. You have to focus on each pitch, make the call. I liked working behind the plate. It was, I felt like I was more assertive doing that. I was very alert. Some of the base umpires would just stand there, like they were, a ball would fly over their heads. They just had to stand there. And you could afford to sort of daydream in those positions. But home plate, really, you had to be attentive to every pitch. I remember one evening game, I was umpiring. It was between Fort Defiance and Harrisonburg high schools. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but all high school games go 7 innings, but this game went 14 innings. That evening, it started at 6 o'clock, finished at 10 o'clock at night. I was tuckered out when I got home, and it was cold that night, and I was sweating inside my chest guard and my shin guards. I was sweating because we were moving around making calls. But after the game, I felt the coldness coming on. And then I got 2 checks for 14 innings. I got paid essentially double. But 14 innings of that, got home, just crashed out. And had several really fond memories of those officiating days. This is a football coach. I enjoyed being a football, basketball, baseball coach for VSDB for almost 30 years. Okay, that's my career, my experience. Essentially, growing up, the obstacles I faced growing up, I'll give you some examples of that. One morning, walking around the neighborhood around my house, walking up and down the hills, there was a car that came up beside me. A man stopped to ask for directions, speaking out his window, and I signed to him, I'm deaf. And he sort of just, waved on. And he didn't want to be bothered or deal with the communication between me. But I just let him know that I can help him. I have a notepad ready. I carry this at all times, pencil and paper. Sometimes if another car would come up for directions, I can write down, may I help you? And sometimes people would be shocked. Oh, okay, you can write back and forth. And then I would give them directions, letting the person know that deaf people can be good Samaritans. It's not as if we can't help. Being deaf, meaning you're hopeless? No, of course not. We can help hearing people. We can function. And then, being able to write notes back and forth has been a great help in functioning within the hearing community. One time there was a hearing couple walking around in Charlottesville. They were lost, and I came up to them and told them that I'm deaf. And they started to walk away. And I said, no, can I help you? And then we wrote notes back and forth and gave them directions. They had to go 3 blocks this way or take it right here. And they, thank you so much. So just to show that, deaf people can function within the hearing world. Growing up, I couldn't speak. I tried and tried. Lip reading was never my strong suit. When people would try to speak to me, I'd try to lip read, but I'd rely on the notepad to avoid any unnecessary misunderstandings that could occur. So writing notes back and forth, I was never ashamed of that. I wanted to make communication easier if possible. I wanted to have access, just like a hearing person would have, writing notes back and forth. If you can't hear, give me directions just like you would a hearing person. Just write back and forth with me. Don't rely on lip reading if it's not your strong suit. If someone says words like Matt, that, Pat, those words coming off the mouth look very similar. If it turns into a guessing game, the consonants coming off people's lips, you can easily misunderstand what they're saying. So, does anyone have any questions or particular things to?
Was his brother born deaf?
Yes. My brother was born deaf. Again, unknown illness. Yeah. Nothing didn't pin down the reason. Yeah, go
That
ahead.
was my question about his brother, why his brother was deaf.
Yeah, same question.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. My brother was the only one born deaf out of the whole family. So he was, but not quite sure why. And Rachel has a question. So Rocco, you've met deaf people from around the world? I have. So how do you communicate? Yeah. I traveled to Italy. I happened to meet a group of deaf Italians in a park in Italy. And they were very oral people. They used a lot of their mouth movements, a lot of facial gestures, a lot of body language. So after a while, I was able to catch on to their method. So 1 or 2 days, I had to pick up their intricacies of the Italian language, but very orally based. In the Italian language, every word tends to end with a vowel. That's just predominantly Italian. So maybe that goes along with how they speak. I'm not sure. Adrian has a question. When did you graduate from Gallaudet? Before you were born. Long time ago, 1964. When were you born, Adrian? 1996. Oh, 1995. You were born in 1995. Before Mary Beth When was the last time you went to the New Jersey School for the Deaf? When was the last time you visited, and has anything really changed since you've been there? I just visited 3 years ago for the big reunion. I did see a lot of changes. Some of the dorms had closed. The enrollment has dwindled. They haven't found a superintendent. Right now they have a interim superintendent. The interim superintendent was the former superintendent of the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf. They wanted to do a national search and find a good candidate for their superintendent position. So I hope they get someone really good to fulfill that role and improve the school. But right now, New Jersey is almost broke, so they're having money issues. And he's saying, yeah, I heard they're having money problems. I was wondering if they had closed.
As an instructor, are you seeing enrollments that for people that speak actually exceeding the deaf community?
People that speak? Clarify what you mean, sorry.
Are people learning ASL, or are more people learning ASL than are actually that are deaf?
Okay. It depends on where you are. If deaf schools offered ASL programs from birth to graduation age, you would see those students have larger numbers. But some schools don't offer ASL programs to kids that young. Are you asking, are there more hearing people who learn sign than there are just deaf people? Is that what you mean?
Is that a growing trend?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, especially younger students, yes. Older people tend to struggle learning signs. It's just an unfortunate. A few people they can acquire the language, but really offering ASL courses to hearing students for 2 years isn't enough. In order to master ASL, it requires 8 years. You have to really intermingle with deaf people, socialize with them, breathe with them, eat with them, sort of live that life, and you will acquire that innate sense of sign. 2 years is just really not enough. Student was asking, your deaf school, did it have football, basketball, soccer, wrestling, and so forth? They had basketball, soccer, baseball. The football program it closed long ago, but they're thinking about reinstating the football program. They have to have enough enrollment to reinstate the football program. Maybe I'll go back to coach, who knows? Hello, sir.
I had the privilege of coaching against Rocoo when I was at Wilson Memorial.
Oh, okay.
He was at BSDB. And not only was he a great coach, but he was also a great person to work with. I also watched him work as an official, and he did an excellent job as an official. No one ever questioned his hearing, but occasionally they did question his eyesight.
So this gentleman was a former coach for Wilson High School a long time ago, one of the best coaches in the area, retired too soon, moved up to an administrative position, and you got your PhD, your doctorate? Yes, from Penn State, correct?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Virginia.
Oh, Virginia, UVA? UVA. But did you attend Penn State at some point?
I grew up here.
Oh. Okay. His last name is Zapatosny? How do you say that? Is that right? Okay.
That's exactly right.
Great coach, by the way, and a great person. Very, very classy person.
I remember in the early 60s that I took my girls from Buffalo Gap High School, played basketball with his girls at BSD, and this was one of the greatest experiences those girls said they'd ever had.
And it was great for our deaf students to play against the hearing schools. It was great for both sides. What? One student asked, does Gallaudet University have sports? Yes, they have football, basketball, baseball, they have a swimming team, wrestling, a track team. And now Gallaudet's on the rise. The Gallaudet Division, the Gallaudet women's team entered in the NCAA tournament but lost. But they were able to get in the NCAA tournament for Division III schools. Okay. Sorry, I'll copy your question and answer. What's it feel like to be a role model for deaf community and hearing community both? You're looked up to and respected by both hearing and deaf people. What's that feel like? Wow. Well, you have to be humble. I like people. I like to socialize. I'm a people person. To serve as a role model to students, I like to encourage the students, push them very hard. I want the best for them. You encourage their potential. Don't let them be lazy. I remember I want the best for deaf children. I remember my mother and father, they had a hard life. They struggled quite a bit financially. My mother and father, they just wanted me to be successful. They didn't want me to struggle. So they were great role models to me. Attending school, high school, and in Gallaudet, seeing a lot of those teachers who were successful. And it wasn't only the deaf professors, but the hearing professors who were very fluent also served as great role models for me. They were very committed to deaf education, so they were great role models too. So it wasn't just the deaf professors. So in that sense, deaf and hearing people have the ability to be role models just the same. Okay. The question is, back then you said you had a happy school life growing up in a deaf school. Now, compare it to modern deaf residential schools. What do you see? Can you compare those two experiences? During my time, a lot of the kids stayed in school, like I said, over the weekends. And I love that. And these days, the kids go home every Friday. And I feel like this is hurting the students' their social skills. Because during my time, we would play our homecoming games, football, or whatever it might be, with other schools from the deaf from New York, Connecticut. They would travel to our school. They stayed with us during the weekend. We would socialize. We would party over the weekend with these other deaf students. And our kids would learn from them, and vice versa. They would learn from our students. And it was a great experience. And in my time, the dorm staff, our supervisors were all very fluent in sign language, great supervisors. They would have workshops. They would have activities over the weekend. And it was just, I never felt lonely in that setting. And I want you to keep in mind that from 3 to 5, all kids had to go outside after school. You had to be outside playing or in the gym. You had to be active. You would never just go back to the dorm. You had to exercise, have that sort of physical component. But now kids sometimes go into the dorm and stay there for, I just feel like that doesn't meet the sort of the requirement for total student development today. I feel like that's not really served. And I think it's hurting the students. I feel like that 3 to 5 activity concept could be promoted a little more. And the dorm staff that I had at New Jersey School for the Deaf, the hearing they could sign, and we'd all go to football games or a college or professional game, and I'd learn from all these field trips and these experiences, and learning from these hearing people, and telling their stories, their experiences. Some of them were at war, they were veterans, and tell stories about their lives. And these are hearing people, but I learned so much from them. I mean, we would all sit around and just be totally fascinated about what they had to say. So the highly structured program I had at my school really helped day and night. And I feel like our school could do much better. I remember visiting a private school, Madeira School in Madeira School. It was a private school in Northern Virginia. Our girls basketball team from, at that time, Model Secondary School for the Deaf, played basketball against that private school. After the game, they invited us to eat at their mess hall, their cafeteria. I remember going to their mess hall, eating, and I saw one room off to the side. Door was closed, and over the top sign on the door said vocabulary room. I was curious, so I went to the vocabulary room, and on the walls and everywhere, they had all these words starting with Z. And I asked someone, so explain to me what this is all about. So 3 times a week, the students would all go into this room for a 1-hour vocabulary study hour to develop their vocabulary, to keep the kids busy, to teach them to advance their vocabulary, advance their education. So it wouldn't just be eat dinner and go back to the dorm and just sit around. So they found a way to really engage the kids 24 hours a day. And the dorm life is really important for a student to fully develop all senses of who they are. I hope that answers your question.
My question is probably twofold. How did your mother deal with having you gone? Were you gone all year long?
Yeah, my mother, it was traumatic for my mom. She had 2 sons who were deaf. It was tough for her. But again, she was very strong, thank God. She was very optimistic, one of the best for our sons. Now, going off to residential school, seeing us do well throughout the years, it was a relief to her to have us be successful in that setting. The potential to go into college, and she really continued to push us. So that success that we attained, I wanted to be a teacher. My brother, again, was in the vocational department, but us growing up in the deaf school, it relieved her that we had found success there. We both were gainfully employed, and I was married, my brother got married, but my mom said that she felt like my wife straightened me out.
There's a second part here. When my son first started coming to VSDB, he was only home every 2 weeks. Then it went to every week. I do understand what you're saying about in the school more socialization and all the good camaraderie that comes with that. But from a parent, when your child is away, it is very hard. Many nights I cried.
Oh, I absolutely understand.
Okay.
Today, the parents have a different attitude. That's why they don't want to send their very young deaf children to a residential school. So typically, at the local school, they'll be a day student at a local school. And I understand it. And as the child gets older, maybe middle school age, they might be more ready to deal with themselves, and then go to a residential school. And I understand you perfectly. I totally understand where you're coming from.
you think the camaraderie is pretty unique to the deaf boarding schools, or whether you might find this in hearing boarding schools also, just people being together all the time?
Yeah, I think it's very similar experience. To live in a dorm with all your peers, having the school there, the dorm life, the activities all intertwined, the organizations, all of that, yeah, you really do have that strong bond. And again, 14 years having that foundation, that experience. It's like a big family that you develop.
He said growing up in the deaf school that he went to, that if the instructors stressed oral communication a lot, does he feel that was a mistake? And then what is the focus now? Is it still they stressed oral a lot, or like a VSTV, or is it mostly American Sign Language?
He already answered. It wasn't. I feel like it was a mistake. Sorry, I'm just letting you know he answered. Okay. And there are some residential schools who still enforce the oral approach, the program. That's good for kids who lost their hearing. They're late deafened. They can still maintain good speech and articulation. And now, special ed students are required to have IEPs. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. But so the mother and father want their deaf children to if the mother and father want them to maintain good speech, if they already have those skills, that's something that that is fine. They can have that. Profoundly deaf students who don't have those skills, the oral approach doesn't seem to work with that. And just to give you a classic example of that, a long time ago at the Illinois School for the Deaf, there were 2 departments. One of the departments was called the manual department, and the other was the oral department. The students who could speak would attend the oral department of the school. The students who were profoundly deaf could not speak, could not articulate. That sounded sort of hard to. They were inept at speaking. They went to the manual department. So, but
What
that
does
philosophy stuff.
VSTV do then?
Does VSTV still have the oral approach? That's for younger kids. It's sort of that's waned now. That's less now.
So now it's mostly ASL?
Yes. High school especially, high school, older. Middle school, that's something that should start younger. It should be more emphasized as a younger student. But.
I
was wondering if you could tell the story about, remember how you just brought up about the deaf students at your deaf school, and they went to see the superintendent and they told him, I'm surprised that you passed. Remember the part of the story that you said he called the students who signed and couldn't speak well, low functioning or something? Can you tell that?
Yeah, that superintendent at the New Jersey School for the Deaf was there for 30-some years. He was a very good vocational principal, very well versed in to be the vocational principal. Now he was promoted to superintendent. His philosophy I didn't agree with. He strongly believed that any deaf student who could not speak couldn't be successful in life. That was his philosophy. A deaf person who could talk and articulate could be successful. My good buddy, his name is Larry. He came from he had deaf parents. He absolutely could not speak at all. Could not articulate. Grew up unable to speak, but was a late bloomer. Passed the entrance exam, got into Gallaudet, and now he has a PhD. So I'm sure the superintendent is rolling over his grave. One more question. One more. Yeah. Was everybody able to hear what she asked?
Could you repeat it for the camera?
Okay.
Mainstream learning at a deaf school, have deaf roles and deaf
Okay. Do you think that deaf schools can offer a unique experience because of the deaf role models as opposed to mainstream schools, which you wouldn't have that experience there? You think that's a good, unique experience? Absolutely. In a deaf residential school, the teachers teach directly to the student. They counsel them. They have personal anecdotal experience that they can share with the student. That they're a successful deaf role model, and that's something the student can connect with. At a mainstream school, a deaf student is watching an interpreter sign all day for hours. The interpreter doesn't stop signing, so the interpreter's taking in information, interpreting it to ASL. The deaf student, the eye strain that comes along with that. You might not realize. I had a 2-hour university class before, and watching an interpreter for 2 hours from a lecture from a fast-speaking professor is very hard on your eyes. And then let's say you move to another class, history. Yep, maybe it's the same interpreter, maybe it's another interpreter, who knows. Another 1-hour class, a history class. Then you go to a biology class. So that experience all day, let's say 6 hours, of watching an interpreter, having someone with you, it's like a Velcroed interpreter to you. And you're just stuck with this person all day. And after class, the interpreter goes home, interpreter's gone, the student roams the hall, becomes very isolated in that environment. And maybe some of their hearing peers want to, it's kind of a cool thing to be around a deaf kid, and then after that, that sort of wears off and they become isolated. And then you have, one deaf student here, one deaf student there, become very isolated. In Northern Virginia, they have a self-contained, or some public schools have self-contained classes where they have all the deaf kids in one class. But in small towns where there's small deaf populations, there's only one student, and they're just inundated with hearing people. That's their experience, and that's very hard. It's a very limited life experience. And you go home, let's say their parents don't sign, you have to figure out how to converse with your parents, and then the next morning it's all over again. So, there is pros and cons. Some people say mainstream schools have better educational opportunities, but here at VSTB they follow the standards of learning. The curriculums are the same, so the state requirements are the same. So, the hearing parents oftentimes think that mainstream schools offer better education. I still have a soft spot for residential schools. I might be biased, but I already grew up there. I already taught at a residential school. I've taught at day schools. I've taught at Model Secondary School for the Deaf, and I prefer residential schools out of all those. If I had to do it all over again, I'd go back to residential school just the same. That's just my opinion.
As a parent of a deaf child coming from a hearing family, my son went to Lowell in the residential, and the hearing parent's opinion was the better school. Which one?
What your opinion was?
That the residential PSDB was the better school for my son.
Some deaf students, they can function very well, very successfully in a mainstream environment. Residual hearing plays a big part of that. The ability to articulate and speak plays a big part of that. Their maturity level. Again, that's a small percentage of the students that we encounter. The cons are to play sports, that opportunity might not always present itself. And if they're an exceptional athlete, yeah, they might get on the sports team. The coach is dying to have that kid who's a great physical specimen. But your average deaf student, probably not going to have that opportunity. At deaf schools, the deaf residential schools, everyone has that opportunity. You have the social component. You can be a part of any of the teams. A large mainstream high school, that student can be pushed aside. So I played football, basketball, baseball. In my experience, I competed with hearing high schools. I really enjoyed it. So I had that opportunity. Okay. Thank you all. Hello, I'm Rocoo DeVito. I'm deaf. Are you hearing? Okay, just to make sure. I attended a residential school. On the weekends, we'd go to movies. We'd go, what they call them, hearing movies, because there was no captioning. And so as a deaf person, I didn't understand what they were saying. I loved to watch Cowboys and Indians movies, cartoons, but again, there was no captioning. So I would just be watching the movies and guess what was happening. Beautiful color and scenery, in a fight scene, but I wouldn't understand 100% of what was happening. But I still enjoyed watching the movies. But at the residential schools on Thursdays, all the students would go to the auditorium and they showed captioned films. This was during the early 50s, and having a caption there helped quite a bit. This was from NCI, which they had these old 16mm film. They would interpret the movies or caption the movies. Now it's interesting, my wife is absolutely crazy about TCM. She watches movies every night because every evening they have the older movies that they've captioned since the old days, so it makes up for all the lost time she has. So it's like a religious experience for her to watch those old movies. You know, missing all those movies, being frustrated as a youngster, and now getting to catch up on that. And so now I'm hearing more and more that ASL films are coming out. I've seen two. The first one, can't remember the title. Oh, Wrong Game. This movie has an all-deaf cast, you know, taking turns signing back and forth. It's really a great movie. The second movie was Legend of the Mountain Man, and even that's a great movie. It's has a beautiful scenery. It's set in Montana, and it's great. You know, people are sounding fluently. I can understand 100% of what's happening there, all the conversations. And I'm trying to develop my own movie, 15 or 20 minutes. It's sort of a comedy. It's sort of just my own creation. I made up this story. It's only one character, but the person plays two different roles. He switches back, role shifts throughout the movie. So I plan on showing that later at the school. When I get the ASL film, I'll show it. At no charge, of course.